What is grief? What does it mean to experience grief? And what does it do?
I would say that grief is loss. And our minds, bodies, and spirits saying things aren't as they should be. And there's multiple sources of grief: loss of innocence, loss of your voice, loss of your dignity, loss of a person, but loss, mainly loss.
I'm thinking about our son, who is 6, and I mentioned to some of you all, we lost our dog of 13 years 13 months ago. And what has been really impactful for me is seeing him grieve. And I don't remember by the time I was 6, having lost anyone close to me yet, right? Actually, it's been 13 months, but just lately, he's been really having a hard time. And he'll say, Mama, I really miss Madeline. And we have this stuffed mini schnauzer. We got him, and he'll hold her, and he'll still cry. It's like this, in this situation, longing for what was, what can't be, and not having yet imagination for how to keep feeling with that disconnect and loss.
I was having a conversation with someone earlier this week around the same question, like, what is grief? Posing it in a different way, I was asking the question, like, can you grieve towards something? Rather, like, is grief necessarily a loss? And so I was thinking about, like, can you grieve injustice? Like, can you grieve the way things should be, right? Which doesn't, it's not exactly the same thing as loss, unless you're looking at it through the lens of, like, there was a perfect expression and now things are not that way. And so we can feel, I was like, maybe it's a pain for the way things should be. And because it shouldn't be that your dog dies, right? Like, that was not the original intent, in my perspective. And so, like, there's a grieving towards versus a grieving the loss of.
I mean, I love that idea of grieving towards, but it's funny because loss was not something that came to my mind at first. Like, my experience of the question was very sort of like a lectio divina, of like an image that came, and it was of basically practicing calligraphy in the sand. And grief is like the disruptive thing that agitates the sand, and grief is what happens afterwards. That it's a reckoning, in a sense, with the disruption, which can be sort of lamenting the fact that what was smooth or what was pristine has been disrupted, but it's also might be the beginning of something new, I guess, which I feel like is linked to your grieving towards.
What I really appreciate about that as well is that grief isn't necessarily as linear as we'd like it to be. To grieve something that never was seems like a possibility. One of the definitions that I've been playing around with lately is connected to loss, and it's an idea of you grieve something that is irreparably harmed. I think when we grieve, it deals with the way that we construct ourselves, we construct our identities, and we realize that our identity isn't totally within our own self. And so when you lose something, you actually have lost yourself. And I don't just mean like a memory, the actual constitution of the self. And part of what grieving an animal does is make you realize that the self isn't strictly other human beings or other two-leggeds, as you said. The self actually is constituted by the spaces, the lands, the animals that we interact with, the people. And when we experience that irreparable harm, or the washing away of something that you cannot draw it the same way that it was. I keep wondering if grief has something to do with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that. I think I don't know how to define grief, but I know what it's done to me in the past. There's a lot of ways that it acts upon me, but one of the ways that I find most mysterious about grief, and I was sharing with you all yesterday that I don't cry on my own ever, but when I do get very sad, it almost always happens when I'm in the grocery store. And I'm walking around, but I find myself walking very slowly and feeling really connected to each person that I come across in ways that I don't feel when I'm not feeling grief. And so there's something about grief that feels connective, that blurs the lines between me and other people. Yeah.
As we were talking, and we have been talking about grief, I've been thinking about rituals of grief, that we need rituals in order to grieve whatever it is, the irreparable harm or the loss, or whatever the source is. And I'm from Nicaragua, and when we lose someone, when someone has passed away, and in English we say, "I'm sorry for your loss." And that's how we give our condolences to each other. But in Nicaragua, the Spanish phrase is "le acompaño en su dolor." I accompany you in your suffering, or I accompany you in your pain. And "I'm sorry for your loss" is a bit distant for me, but I accompany you in your pain, Barnabas, and now I'm going to keep vigil with you. And so there's 2 or 3 days of vigil where people fill your house, vigilia. They bring hot coffee, and they bring their own chairs, and the house is full. No one is trying to fix your pain. No one is trying to, or most of the time, no one's trying to explain it away. But people just sit with you, and they keep vigil. And so that accompaniment theology from Latin America, I've come to appreciate even more. And again, it doesn't fix everything. And, we're human doers. We want to do something when something has happened. So we do bring a meal to care for our bodies that are grieving. But that accompaniment of "le acompaño en su dolor" comes back to me often, and how I try to accompany people in their suffering and pain. It's a ritual.
Thinking about that, there's in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, those whom you call, in order to draw the water from your eyes. So grief isn't something, so to speak, that you could just approach very simply. You often do require help in order to do it. It's not something that can be individually engaged all the time, but that requires somebody to accompany you and to create the conditions for grief to occur.
Yes. I think one of the first stages of grief is denial. I'm not a professional, but I think Jessica here could tell us that. And my first experience of grief was losing my mother when I was 11 years old. She died in an airplane crash. And so as an 11-year-old, I don't have the coping mechanisms to draw the tears out of my eyes. I'm just in shock. And people came to our home and filled it with their presence as we waited to hear back from the mountain to see if she would be alive or not. I don't remember what anyone said to me that day. And then 3 days later, when her body was found, and 4 days later, we had a church service. I don't remember who said what, but it was a long church service. This is Nicaragua we're talking about. Don't remember what the sermon was about. Don't remember what anyone said, but I remember who was there. So I love your idea of the Hebrew Bible saying there's people that come alongside you. So in accompaniment theology, I remember who was there, and I remember who was crying with me. One of my cousin Eddie, sat down next to me, and he wept so hard that his body was shaking, and I was just in shock. But it made my body respond. It was as if his body was saying, "I too feel what you're feeling." And so we need others to say, "Yes, this is awful what happened to you." There's no explanation. No explanation. You can't say God did this to you, but this is awful. This shouldn't be. Things aren't as they should be. And I remember his presence, and I remember that his tears drew out my tears, and I needed help to be able to be given the freedom to cry and lament, for days.
I think one of the things that's coming to mind for me is the idea of accompaniment, of being with richly and intimately. And the way we're talking about loss is when we lose someone, we lose, in a sense, who we were also with that person. There's a sense of loss of self, and a sense of then kind of isolation from that person, from who we understand ourselves to be. And what strikes me is thank you for sharing your story about with your mother and the way the community came together and grieved. And in my own family in the last few years, we lost a family member, and there was not a coming together. There was not a way that people came and said, let's come and grieve. And it's been interesting now in the years since, seeing the ways that this has been this unresolved thing that people don't know how to talk about. And how that loss of who we were with our cousin has resulted in sort of a loss of communion on a certain level, and a not knowing how to open up and be vulnerable with each other, because it's unrecognized and unprocessed, and that distance from self then creates distance in the community as well. And I don't know, that's just sad.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the questions you asked was like, what kind of blocks us from being able to grieve? And I think trauma and fear, like fear of not being able to come out the other side of grief, is something that that keeps us from entering into it. And I was laughing because earlier we were voting on which tea to have on the table, and several people were like, "Oh, we got to get the Roman chamomile." And I was saying, as someone who helps to facilitate a kind of emotional change that creates the environment to be able to go into grief, to say basically it's okay, it's safe to go into grief. In clinical aromatherapy, I use Roman chamomile as a plant, as a gift that the Creator has given us, that helps literally in your mind, like in the limbic center of your brain, where your emotions and your memories are housed, right? And where you have the hippocampus and the amygdala, right? Like these things that flood your body with hormones that can kind of get you stuck. Well, this oil, when you smell it, actually soothes that and it slows it down. And so we can offer that to people as a way, like a physical, tangible way to create the environment for people to be able to grieve. I said, if you go into a funeral home and you smell that funeral parlor smell, it might be formaldehyde, but generally it's Roman chamomile, right? Like they diffuse Roman chamomile to help people to be able to grieve well. And so if we learn these things, then we're able to help each other as we accompany people into their grief and then through it and out the other side. Yeah.
I think I'm really struck by when you first asked your first very easy question, what is grief? There's this default part of me that individualizes it. Growing up, my parents are migrated from Taiwan, and a lot of survival in the home. And in their busyness and also just like tension and things in family life, I learned as an older daughter, if I have needs, I figure it out myself. And so whenever I needed to cry, go to your own room and cry. Because if mom and dad see you, it will be a burden to them, right? They will worry about you, all these things. And so contrast that to our son, who, and this reminds me of what you've been sharing about Barnabas, which is he only cries with us. I'm fairly certain, I mean, at school, if he gets hurt, certainly, but he doesn't like lock himself in his own room and we never hear him cry. Like when he's sad, he'll come wailing to us. And I just am having words now to sense like grief is our shared human reality. Like that's what it is. And I'm being reminded of a wise, dear friend, Reverend Dr. Kevin Doy. He and I had this conversation once about how this is like the one thing in common that all human beings have, which is like grief. And so I guess I'm thinking all this just to say that like feeling it so raw from our son is this weird mirror to me about like how and when we grieve and what's permitted. My context had limitations, and they were, related to migration and generation and all kinds of complex things. And but in an ideal space, like we can do it together and be what we need to. And when I think about your grocery store thing, I feel that at the airport, right? Which is like all these people I don't know, but I feel this deep connection. And I love traveling alone because I feel like there is this, and it's not joy that I feel like we're sharing. It is this, so I don't know, that's not meant to be funny, but it's like, oh, totally, but it's like, where are all people going? What are the things that everyone is carrying, right? Like the load. And so, yeah, I'm sensing what you're sharing.
Everything about it diminishes our belief in our own ability to control everything around us. Something was taken from us without our control. And then I think grief itself, I think one of the reasons we refuse it is because there's a sense that like, actually, I'm not in control of grief itself. Grief seems to be outside of me, and my only choice is whether or not I allow it to haunt me or possess me. Sometimes, like a literal, like if I were to give myself over to this, I think about this often in my own family, like we've had so many defense mechanisms to survive in America, that like there is a sense of like, but if we were to crack that faucet open, we'd be taken over. We would never recover. But I think so a grocery store seems to me like another place where it's like, you're just reminded like, I need these things. I like do not survive on my own. I am like actually incredibly vulnerable and dependent upon everything else. And like this myth of my own agency, it doesn't work here. And here we all are gathered together to try to figure out how to make it to the next day, what food I need to eat tonight to get to tomorrow, just to get through. And these are all contexts of extreme vulnerability that we're trying to cope with. And that we keep trying to evade. We don't want to admit that actually we have far less control, far less ability to determine our life and our well-being than we'd like to.
It's interesting you say that. It kind of makes me sad and frustrated and in some ways angry, right? Like where that ability to choose to defend myself from grief or to enter into it was taken away, right? So for my African-American side, we were talking about like fix your face, right? Like you're not allowed to demonstrate or express any sort of negative emotion. You're not allowed to enter into grief. And the reason why that is a thing is historically linked to the Jim Crow era. And there were laws that were put in place that said if you are a Black person, you are approached by a white person, you don't have the legal ability to be able to enter into grief, right? Like you can't have that sort of place. And so that is taken away from you. And because if you did, you could die. Like you can literally be lynched. Right. And that is passed down as a safety mechanism, like generation after generation. And so now it's just what we do. Right. And so in our families, like at least in my family, it was like, you're not allowed. That's disrespectful. Well, disrespectful for who? Like to whom, right? And so there's frustration, and now I feel like I'm grieving the lack of ability to grieve, right? Because it was taken from us.
As much as I love these rituals that I'm trying to recuperate from my Nicaraguan spirituality and indigenous spirituality, we were talking yesterday, and I mentioned this as well, that toxic machismo also has wounded men and women and siblings. And one thing that I've had to intentionally interrupt in my family lineage is I would hear my father say, men don't cry. And if, one of my brothers was upset about something, it's like you stuff your feelings, like, why are you crying? But not in a, why are you crying? But why are you crying? Like, it is a survival mechanism because generationally and historically, you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to make it through the day. And so it's been a coping mechanism, and you can empathize and have compassion. But then also I've seen how it has wounded Latino men. And so something that I've done intentionally to disrupt that with my son is that I ask him 2 questions every day. What was your favorite part of the day? And then I ask him, did anything make you sad today? Did anyone make you sad? I especially did that when he was little and he didn't know how to express emotion, or he had big emotions. And of course, I ask that sometimes at like 9 p.m. and they have things to say. I'm like, oh my gosh, now we're really talking about your emotions. But you have to realize what we have inherited, the memories and the experiences and the things that block grief communally and also in the families. And I think we have to be aware, or I have to be aware of how to do that gently, while still honoring the reasons why I know why my father would have to say that, and also say, I have to imagine a different way that my son can be angry, and it's okay for boys to cry and be sad.
I appreciate you sharing about like a constructive way to channel that, because Kenny, after hearing you speak, and I'm probably showing my cards here, but just, instinctively, I'm thinking about, this is a conversation about grief, healing, and humanity. And in light of just that weight and the compounding, like feeling like you're grieving, not being able to grieve, something I've been wrestling with in some of the readings I've been doing is like, what is the role of hope? Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to be naive, but like, what does healing look like in that context? And is it possible, or is it naive to hope for healing?
I mean, it's a great question. There's a West African concept called Sankofa, and what it means is, well, it's a picture of a bird, a mythical bird who is turning around. She's craning her neck in this kind of uncomfortable, painful way to care for an egg that's on her back. And the idea is that she's bringing the traditions and the customs and the rituals, right, like of our ancestors into the present. We live into that in the present, so it transforms us so that our future can be better. And so the idea of remembering the story, we talked a lot about remembering yesterday, like remembering the story, but not in a way that causes us to like clench up or turn inward, but a remembering that transforms us and like sends us out. And so I think of like the place of lament, right? My grandmamas from church would, and you're like, what is going, like, why is she? But like that release allowed them to then be able to hold on to the hope, right? Like you can't hold on to hope or even like begin to move towards healing if you don't have the ability to engage with, or like these rituals and ceremonies are meant to allow us to reconnect with ourselves, right? Like with our history, with our ancestry, so that we can then live into a better future, like an imagined better future.
There's a concept called mid-morning that I was introduced to through post-colonial trauma guy Steph Krapps, who developed it from others. And what do you do when the healing's impossible because injury is unceasing? As the condition that occurs for those who belong to oppressed people groups. What do you do with that? And I think what we've been circling around in this whole conversation and is that one of the challenges is that grief makes an ethical demand. Grief by saying that an injury has occurred. And I think that one of the reasons that that in my family it was hard to watch a kid cry is because the parent knew that they couldn't fix it. And I think that as a society, what you see, I think the reason why, say in Jim Crow, you don't want Black people grieving publicly because that's an indictment on the system.
Tell the truth, yeah.
Because that grief is political to bring it in. And so there is a benefit for those in political power to restrict certain griefs. To make sure that that grief does not come into the public square. Keep your anger out of the public square. Keep this sadness out of the public square because we've already made the perfect world. Don't you go telling us we didn't. but your grief is saying otherwise. It is testifying both to a loss, but as you said, to something that is not yet at the same time.
And I'm thinking about the loss of life consequently, right? Like psychosomatic symptoms, grief held. I only know more of the research on Asian Americans, but Asian American women, high degree of psychosomatization, health disparities, communities of color. I mean, it's not just your landscape, socioeconomic status. It's like all this stuff you carry for generations, and it's like showing up in our bodies.
And so in a sense, like part of the conditions for creating grief has to be to address the systems that produce irreparable harm. It requires it in some way, and it requires it in a communal way, I suppose.
I find it interesting. I'm connecting what you're saying with what Barnabas said earlier about you going to the grocery store. If Roman chamomile, something that we breathe and drink, can elicit grief, your nearness and proximity to other humans, maybe I underestimate, maybe I'm not that smart, I underestimate the power of just our nearness and proximity to people and what they're carrying. Our bodies must know something before we even know. And I know that violence renders our voices inarticulate. And so many times when we've experienced trauma, we don't have the words. We don't have access in the moment, especially when that injustice is happening on an ongoing, sustained basis. We don't have words to say what's happening because we're not fully conscious of it. And so our bodies feel it. So going about your day in the most mundane and ordinary grocery store run, your body, I wonder, perceives your shared humanity with others that are in pain, which also invites you to be attuned to and to your own pain. I wonder.
I also think this is where, from a theological perspective, you can't do it without a connection to the divine, right? Like, if we are in a situation that is, the oppression is continual, right? The only way that you can get through is to have a hope that there is something better, right? Otherwise, we may as well just give up, right? And that concept of the divine and the attribute of immutability, right? Like he's not going to change, right? And if we believe that God is good, then if I have to cling to that, otherwise everything else doesn't work. And the question could be, well, is Christianity the only way to do that? And it's like, well, if the truth or that connection or that relationship to the divine is part of what allows us to move into grief, then whatever name it is there could possibly have some healing effect, right? And the reality is, from my perspective, God was at work everywhere before the missionaries got there, right? And I think about the story of my Hawaiian family, my brothers and sisters over there. They were like, we already worshipped the one true creator. We already worshipped Io and his Kiapono, the son of righteousness, right? And that's what allowed them to survive colonial conquest from Tahiti and from the United States and the continual land grab that is happening now, right? There's this connection with the divine that was there long before the missionaries arrived on their boats.
I'm having this weird sensation of there's a sense of privilege that we have, that we get to talk about grief and reflect on it and observe it. I think it's a true gift because then we can engage with it. But then I'm thinking about, for many people here, I'm sure, whether you're a pastor or a clinician, people you've sat with who just live in grief every day. Like it's a part of life. And they're surviving to make it through, right? Whether it's the suicidal ideation, their own sense of feeling rejected by the church because they're queer, right? All these things that someone carries, and then the pursuit of I think about immigrant families needing to make it. But I feel like all of this functions within our white, cis, hetero, Christian, capitalistic context, which is what is fueling a lot of it. And I just was sensing this because when you're talking about siblings who live on land and are connected to it, and there is spaciousness to connect to God and to reflect the way of life, that energy just feels so different than the energy of every client I'm imagining and every family member I have that lives with perpetual grief. And I don't mean this in like a cynical way where we don't have hope, like your question, but I just feel like grief is every day. And it's not that I actually don't know if the solution is try to resolve it. It's that how do we live with it? Because these are the systems that intersect our every day that we don't have power per se to reject or live outside of. And I'm not having an answer. I'm just thinking out loud. But like as you share this, I'm like, wow. And I have this like fantasy of living in a what do you call it, like a communal space with my high school girlfriends and all their families, and we just make our own food, and it would never happen because we're very urban. But it's like, but then it's like that is the life of grueling, grinding and then making it work. It's just so much. And I think the average person really feels quite burnt out and full of grief of every kind. And you add on all the like social context stuff, but not meant to be a downer, just accepting like this is our reality in a lot of Western spaces. Yeah.
That's so important because it's what you're naming is all the situations that distort what it is that we hope to mean by humanity in the first place. Other systems, capitalism, for example, as you mentioned, or systems that try to reduce, that try to tell that sexuality can only be in one way or something like this, have taken from us our own ability to say what it is that we think life and humanity should be, or what it is that Creator has given it to us to be. And so there has to be this contested edge. And I think that, so one of the things I think that we're also thinking about is like exactly what is healing, for example, and I really don't think that we get much agency in our healing either. I think that you get to clean a wound, but you don't make it heal, right? Like you create the conditions for it. And again, well, how do you heal if the wound is ongoing for all those reasons that you just named? There is a need to create space to facilitate both grief and healing, and then you almost seem to just have to sit back and watch it happen. There's not really a prescription or a process that we get to engage in, only a space that we can attempt to create, and that we keep creating imperfectly.
I don't mean to just circle back, but to me, I see then hope, like the question of hope and how to have hope, and the fact of ongoing grief, a source of ongoing woundedness, and continued creating circumstances for healing, possibly being healed in that, but then knowing that woundedness lies ahead of us as well. Like, what does it mean to, as we are being constantly wounded and healed, as we are constantly carrying grief in our bodies, in our communities, in our isolation and our union with other people? Life is a lot. It's heavy. It's overwhelming. But as we step forward, knowing that each day carries the possibility of healing, but then, in a sense, the promise of grief. That doesn't seem. Yeah, that just seems challenging to me. The dynamics of that seem off, and not the way that I would like them to be, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
I mean, I think in the meantime, we have to be intentional about tending to the space in between. I was talking with a woman named Melanie. She's from the Cook Islands, right? So Pacific Islander. And she was teaching me about this Samoan theology or ideology of tuvuva, if I remember it correctly. And it's the tending to the space in between. Right, and it's tending to the conditions to allow for healing, and so you have to intentionally go and sit with somebody who is grieving. You have to intentionally bring them a meal. You have to intentionally go to the grocery store and look at the people around you. Because how often do we just go into the grocery store and not look at people, right? Not connect with them. But if we're mindful of these small rituals that we can practice every day, knowing that there's this promise of grief around us in a broken world, because we still live in a broken world, then there's an active, it's almost like active listening, right? There's an active leaning into healing in spite of the grief. It's tending to those conditions, caring for.
You just also made me wonder, do we want to get rid of grief? What if grief really is the state of our connection to one another, to land, to animals, and all of that is in constant flux? You're right, grief is a guarantee, but that grief is in a way a testament to the fact that I actually am connected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to get rid of grief, what would that look like? Would it be to say that I am sufficient, completely alone, completely isolated, that I need nothing else? It seems like that is, and that's one of the responses, kind of like what you shared earlier, Gregory, of like let me be alone, is in many ways saying like, I want to be uninjurable. But injurability is just a fact of being anywhere on the planet, not human, just being.
And I'm like, almost hesitated to say this for fear of sounding trite, but like Christ ascended into heaven with holes in his hands,
Right.
And that those are still, presumably when he looks at his hands, there's a reminder of pain and a reminder of promise and of joy as well, which is, I think that's striking. Like that, thinking about Christ ruling and reigning, looking at his hands and being reminded of pain as he's seated on the throne. That seems like it shouldn't fit together, but somehow it does. So I love that point about maybe grief won't ever leave, but that also that it's not necessarily a bad thing, which has been sort of the subtext, well, at least in my mind, of like, oh yeah, grief is bad, let's shake it off and do away with it. But I'm wondering, starting to think, like, I shouldn't do that. Yeah.
Y'all ever seen a pearl? Like, a pearl is like a grain of sand gets inside of the clam and it irritates it. Like it causes trauma to the animal that lives in the shell, right? And one could say, well, just get the grain of sand out of the animal, right? But that's not what happens. It grows around it. And when we think about trauma or we think about grief or we think about wounds and broken, it doesn't go away. Like you said, your son still misses his dog, right? Like he still cries for the dog. And so in some ways, like healing is not getting rid of it. It's not shaking it away. It's growing around it and learning how to manage it. And that calcification around that grain of sand, that irritant, actually becomes something beautiful that then is able to be used to bless people that wear it or whatever. I make jewelry, so like, I think in terms of gems in that way. But like, if you had taken the grain of sand out, that growth would not have happened, right? And it would be worse off.
Gregory, can you say more about why you keep returning to hope, or like what's the importance of it for you?
I think it's something that I'm wrestling with personally, because there's this instinct within me of, as I want to do away with grief, I also want to hope for something better, and I want to get there fast. That's like and that probably is unhelpful. Let me backtrack. That is unhelpful. Barnabas was looking at me like, yeah. And so I think part of me is wrestling with that and coming to terms with the fact that I think that isn't a helpful instinct to move past grief, which is this kind of richly beautiful making of pearls. At the same time, I think hope is also beautiful. I think hope is what motivates so much of the resilience that leads to carving out those empty spaces where healing might take place. And in that sense, I think it's sort of a fact of life that people keep on because there is a hope within them. That, also, like, hope is this is just part of my approach, is like hope is a richly biblical theme. And I think of always be prepared to give a hope that is within you, assuming that there is hope within us, of something that is yet to come that we see in faith, or that we seek in faith. And so I'm sitting in the midst of all of those tensions, and I'm in a lot of different levels, personal and academic or whatever. I'm trying to grapple with what it means to be people of hope, and is the question of, what are the logistics of hope? Is it naive to hope, or is it radical to hope? And so, and I don't know. I'm like sitting in between and being like, maybe could be either, could be both. I'm not sure, but that's where my heart and my mind are at. And at the same time, I do want to hear your reactions to how my comments about that were perceived, because I see how the could have been, are issues with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel heat in my body. And I've shared with you all a little bit about like my own sensitivity around healing as a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think about the ways that I think about the ways that I prayed with a certain kind of hope that was not a great prayer to be praying for me. And actually, I think that grief is indicative of connection and safety. There was a survey that happened last year by School of Psychology, MFT, some psych students, I think, psych PhD students. And I took the survey, and I got to the second half, which was an optional, and it was qualitative answers. And one of the questions that it asked was, do you think that God delights in you? And I stopped for a second, and I was like, do people actually feel that way? And I remember thinking that the people actually that I respect the most, who have the deepest relationships with God, they cry all the time. And I have cried one time with God. And it was a kind of miraculous thing. But so I don't know what to do with hope, because it feels like overcoming something, when sometimes I think that hope is just the condition of our living, like our going on and just living every day. And I don't know.
I think there's the experience that you described feels to me like a disordered hope, right? Like it's not. I don't know that I would call that authentic hope, right? And so I would caution against throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some sense, because people are always going to do things wrongly, right? And for you to define yourself by other people's perception of you, there's a concept called kujichagulia. It's self-determination, right? Like, and if you allow other people to say, you have to grieve in this way, you have to hope in this way, you have to be this way, then you've given away, I mean, in some ways, involuntarily, you've given away your self-determination. And I feel like that's harmful, not to them, but to you, right? And then you're in a place where you're like, oh, because I don't cry all the time, then I don't grieve. And I don't know that's right. Like, I feel like there are unique ways to you that have been gifted to you and to your context that allow you to grieve and to heal and to hope, that are not subject to the definitions of those people that have harmed you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kenny. And I appreciate that, and that you named it was involuntary, that there was something that was taken, like a kind of self-sovereignty or self-determination, because growing up in the church, and I mean, part of the reason I'm doing a PhD program is to recover some of that self-determination, to say, well, I've always been told by conservatives that I have to believe and behave and hope and grieve in this way. But then I've also been told simultaneously by progressives that if I don't follow this other way, then I'm also like deficient in some way.
Right.
And some of my own trying to study here is like trying to recover some sense of like, does the Spirit speak to us? Or do we have to keep being tossed about by statements by other people warring over the Bible, instead of like making space for our own like grief.
I think I'm struggling with the language of self-determination, though, in some ways. I think I should cite my sources. I'm thinking a lot about Judith Butler this whole way through the conversation. Let me just let everybody know that's the brilliant one. I'm just a parrot repeating things. I think the body is the site. It's really complicated. It's the site of where we express our own agency, but it is the site where others express their agency upon us. It is the site where we are perceived as much as we are perceiving. And in fact, those two have a slippage in between them. I can't see myself the way that you can see me. You own my image in a way that I can't, right? Like, and I keep thinking, I'm like, we want to retreat to self-determination, but you can't, because the whole problem of grief is that there are things that will be taken from you. There are things that will happen to you that are beyond your control. And I worry that, you mentioned earlier machismo is this thing, and I think one of the reasons that machismo has to refuse grief is because, that it does refuse grief is because in order to do that, the only way I could become uninjurable is if I make sure I injure all of you first. Is if I make sure that and so Judith Butler, for example, she reflects on 9/11. We don't like being vulnerable, so we'll just eliminate in its entirety anybody who we suspect could make us vulnerable again. So there is a need, I think, to accept that there is a degree of precarity in our lives. And then I think the ethical key, or I wonder and I hope, is to embrace that, but we're all in that position together. So rather than seek to rebuild the castle of pure self-determination, how do we negotiate our precarity together and acknowledge that actually I am vulnerable to you? And actually, you can control me in ways that I wish you couldn't. And I know, I'm sure many of us, that's basically church trauma for a lot of folks, is like, I always say to people, they're like, why are you so angry about this? I'm like, because I allowed somebody to control me in ways that I didn't even realize. And I'm still struggling to recover from that. And it didn't feel like an option to just go and do otherwise. People, why didn't you just leave? I didn't think I could. Right? This situation where you realize that actually the agency doesn't work that way. And so, if anything, and I'm grateful that you brought up Jesus, because there is a certain sense of like, actually, my solution, I am just going to join you in that precarity. And now we've got to think, what is our ethical response to being vulnerable? How are we going to do that together without assuming that you can just get rid of it?
And I want to point out that, because we're talking about grief and healing and humanity, right? That idea of self, from my perspective, from both my African and my indigenous ancestors, that self isn't individual, though. That's right. Yeah, so when I say self-determination, I don't mean I, as an individual, define who I am. Remember that Sankofa, right? Like, she's looking at her traditions. It's Ubuntu, right? Like, I am because we are, right? This is my identity is formed from those that are around me, good or bad, right? But I get to say, like, I get to verbalize that. I get to say, you all have shaped and formed me in these ways, versus living into, you need to do this, you are this, right? Like it's like a collective self. Like, can I say that, right? Like, there's a collective self that then allows me to walk in ways that kind of contradict the brokenness that's being affected on me.
Grief draws us back to the collective self and then makes a request of that collective to re-embrace like its own ethic of collectivity in a certain sense. We have to acknowledge that actually we do belong together, whether we want to or not. That is just the nature of what it is to be us, and it's not even restricted, as we said, to humans.
Can we just give a round of applause?